Imagine yourself standing on a 19th century battlefield where more than 100,000 men face each other in a desperate struggle for control of Europe. On one side stands the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius who dominated the continent. On the other, the Austrians, determined to resist the French advance. But what seemed like an inevitable defeat transformed into one of Napoleon's most strategic victories. How did he accomplish this? And what exactly happened at the Battle of Landshut? On April 21st, 1809, the War of the Fifth Coalition was at its peak. Napoleon, already renowned for his brilliant campaigns, faced a new threat. The Austrian army, led by General Johann von Hiller, with 36,000 men, the Austrians attempted to halt the advance of 77,000 French, Bavarian, and Württemberg soldiers. The Battle of Landshut proved to be a crucial moment in this conflict, marking a decisive turning point in the war. What's particularly fascinating about this battle is how the outnumbered Austrians managed to put up such fierce resistance initially. They fought valiantly, holding strategic positions throughout Landshut until Napoleon himself arrived on the battlefield. It was his presence and tactical genius that ultimately changed the course of history that day. The battlefield itself was a sight to behold. The picturesque Bavarian town of Landshut, with its medieval architecture, became the stage for one of the Napoleonic era's significant confrontations. The river Isar, which runs through the town, played a critical role in the battle's dynamics, becoming both a defensive barrier and ultimately a death trap for retreating soldiers. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires, like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we explore how Napoleon's masterful command of combined arms warfare, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, showcased his tactical brilliance on this blood-soaked battlefield. The War of the Fifth Coalition represented yet another desperate attempt by European powers to contain Napoleon's seemingly unstoppable expansion across the continent. You see, by 1809, much of Europe had already experienced the bitter taste of French domination. Napoleon had crushed previous coalitions with remarkable efficiency, leaving the traditional monarchies of Europe both humiliated and terrified. For Austria, the wounds ran particularly deep. Just 4 years earlier, in 1805, the Habsburg Empire had suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors. On that cold December day, Napoleon had masterfully outmaneuvered the combined Austrian and Russian forces, cementing his reputation as the greatest military mind of his age. The peace that followed stripped Austria of significant territories and influence. But the Austrian Empire was not ready to accept its diminished status. Behind the scenes, Archduke Charles, brother of Emperor Francis I, had been quietly reforming the Austrian military. He modernized their tactics, improved officer training, and expanded the army through a new system of conscription that created a reserve force called the Landwehr. These reforms gave Austria renewed confidence in its military capabilities. Meanwhile, across Europe, the British, who had never submitted to Napoleon, were eager to find continental allies. They promised substantial financial support to anyone willing to stand against the French emperor. With British gold filling their treasury, the Austrians felt ready to challenge Napoleon once more. What made 1809 seem like the perfect moment to strike? Intelligence reports suggested Napoleon was facing multiple crises. His troops were bogged down in the brutal Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal, where British forces under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, were providing fierce resistance. Additionally, rumblings of discontent had emerged in France itself, with economic hardships and the endless warfare testing the people's patience. The Austrian leadership, particularly Foreign Minister Count Stadion, believed Napoleon's empire was overextended and vulnerable. They gambled, that with Napoleon distracted by troubles in Spain and domestic concerns, Austria could reclaim its position by launching a swift, decisive campaign. But there was something the Austrians had fatally miscalculated. Despite appearances, Napoleon had been vigilantly monitoring their military build-up. Through his extensive network of spies and informants throughout Europe, the emperor received detailed reports of Austrian preparations. While pretending to be focused elsewhere, Napoleon had quietly been positioning his forces and preparing for the Austrian attack. When Archduke Charles led his forces into Bavaria, a French ally, in April 1809, he expected to face disorganized resistance from scattered French units. Instead, he would soon discover that the Emperor of the French had anticipated his every move, setting the stage for the dramatic confrontations that would follow, including the crucial Battle of Landshut. When we examine the Battle of Landshut, we're witnessing a clash not just of armies but of military minds. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, already a legend in his own time. By 1809, Napoleon had transformed from a young artillery officer into the Emperor of France and the most feared military commander in Europe. His genius didn't just lie in his understanding of tactics. It was his ability to see the battlefield as a chessboard where he could outmaneuver opponents before they even realized they were in danger. Napoleon had developed what military historians now call the central position strategy. He would divide his forces to confront multiple enemy columns, then rapidly concentrate his troops to overwhelm each enemy division individually before they could unite. This approach required precise timing, flawless communication, and absolute confidence, all qualities Napoleon possessed in abundance. What made Napoleon truly exceptional was his intimate understanding of soldier psychology. He knew when to inspire through grand speeches, when to show personal courage by riding near the front lines, and when to offer rewards to boost morale. His soldiers fought not just for France, but for him personally, the little corporal who had risen from obscurity to reshape Europe. Facing this military colossus was Johann von Hiller, a man whose name doesn't echo through history with the same resonance as Napoleon's, but whose tactical ability deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. Born in 1754 in the Habsburg territories, Hiller had climbed through the military ranks during decades of European warfare. By the time of Landshut, he was 65 years old, ancient by the standards of early 19th century military leadership. Unlike the flamboyant and charismatic Napoleon, Hiller was methodical and measured. He had served with distinction in campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and had earned his position through demonstrated competence rather than political connections. His soldiers respected him not for inspiring speeches, but for his steady hand and clear orders in the chaos of battle. What's fascinating about Hiller is how clearly he understood his disadvantageous position at Landshut. Intelligence reports had informed him that his 36,000 men faced nearly 80,000 enemy troops. Most generals might have chosen immediate retreat when confronted with such odds. Instead, Hiller made the calculated decision to stand and fight, not out of recklessness, but strategic necessity. Hiller's plan was to delay the French advance long enough to allow the main Austrian army under Archduke Charles to reposition itself. Every hour he could hold Landshut potentially saved thousands of Austrian lives elsewhere. He entrusted his defensive line to experienced regiments like the Davidovich infantry, and positioned his artillery to maximize the natural defensive features around the town. The Austrian general was counting on the renowned discipline of his troops, men trained in the white-coated regiments of the Habsburg military tradition. These soldiers were drilled to maintain formation under fire and execute complex maneuvers with precision. The Austrian artillery was particularly respected across Europe, often operated by gunners with decades of experience. What Hiller hadn't anticipated was Napoleon's personal arrival on the battlefield. Initial French attacks had been led by Marshal Massena, giving the Austrians hope they might hold their positions. But when Napoleon's distinctive bicorn hat appeared on the ridge overlooking Landshut, everything changed. The Emperor immediately took command, assessed the situation, and issued a series of orders that transformed a frontal assault into a complex envelopment maneuver. Within hours, French forces were crossing the river Isar at multiple points, threatening to encircle Hiller's entire corps. What had been a disciplined defense suddenly became a desperate fight for survival. Hiller's greatest challenge was no longer holding ground. It was extracting his army before it was completely destroyed. The confrontation between these two military minds would result in one of the most dramatic battles of the 1809 campaign, with consequences that would reverberate across the continent. Dawn broke on April 21st, 1809, revealing the picturesque Bavarian town of Landshut, shrouded in morning mist. The medieval stone bridges spanning the river Isar would soon become the focal point of one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Napoleonic Wars. The Austrian forces under General von Hiller had established formidable defensive positions. They had fortified the town itself with sharpshooters positioned in church towers and sturdy stone buildings. Their artillery commanded the approaches to the bridges, while cavalry units waited in reserve, ready to counter any French advance. The Austrian strategy was straightforward but sound: hold the river crossings at all costs and prevent the French from establishing a foothold on the eastern bank. The battle erupted at first light when Marshal Massena's French divisions launched their initial assault on the bridges. What followed was nothing short of carnage. The narrow stone structures created perfect killing zones, with Austrian artillery firing point-blank into the advancing French columns. The waters of the Isar ran red as French soldiers fell by the dozens. The Bavarian allies of the French, particularly the 1st and 3rd Light Infantry regiments, suffered horrific casualties in these early attacks. One French officer, Captain Jean-Baptiste Barce of the 26th Light Infantry, later wrote in his memoirs, "Never had I witnessed such slaughter. Our men advanced with admirable courage into what seemed certain death. The bridge became so covered with bodies that the living walked upon the dead to continue their advance." For several hours, the Austrians held firm. The renowned Gyulai Infantry Regiment stood its ground despite punishing French artillery fire. By midday, it appeared the defenders might actually repel the larger French force. French casualties mounted alarmingly, with estimates suggesting they lost nearly 2,000 men in these initial failed assaults. Everything changed, however, with the arrival of Napoleon himself around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. After personally assessing the battlefield from a nearby hill, the Emperor immediately recognized the tactical error in the frontal assault strategy. "We are making the same mistake at the same river," he reportedly said to Marshal Lannes, referring to similar difficulties faced at previous river crossings. Napoleon promptly redirected his forces. While maintaining pressure on the bridges to fix the Austrian attention, he dispatched General Saint-Hilaire's division 3 miles upstream to cross at a partially destroyed wooden bridge at Meusburg. Simultaneously, he ordered Marshal Lannes to take his entire corps downstream to locate additional crossing points. What followed demonstrated Napoleon's genius for battlefield adaptation. Rather than continuing to throw men into the meat grinder of the main bridges, he applied pressure from multiple directions. Saint-Hilaire's men successfully forced a crossing at Meusburg, quickly establishing a bridgehead. Meanwhile, Lannes discovered a ford where his cavalry could cross, allowing him to begin threatening the Austrian right flank. By 4 o'clock, Hiller realized his position was becoming untenable. French forces were now crossing the river at 3 different points, threatening to encircle his entire force. He ordered a fighting withdrawal, but maintaining order during a retreat in the face of an aggressive enemy is one of warfare's greatest challenges. As the Austrians began pulling back from the town, Napoleon unleashed his coup de grâce, the cavalry. The French 14th Dragoons and 5th Hussars charged into the retreating Austrian columns, transforming an orderly withdrawal into chaotic flight. The narrow streets of Landshut became a trap for the Austrians, with French infantry pushing from the front while cavalry cut off escape routes. Perhaps the most dramatic moment came when a battalion of the Hungarian Esterházy regiment found itself cornered in the town marketplace. Rather than surrender, they formed a defensive square and fought to the last man, their white uniforms stained crimson as French forces closed in from all sides. By nightfall, the battle had been decisively won by the French. Von Hiller had managed to extract about 2/3 of his forces, but at terrible cost. The Austrians lost over 4,000 men killed or wounded, with another 3,000 taken prisoner. Equally devastating was the loss of nearly 30 artillery pieces and hundreds of supply wagons, resources the Austrian Empire could ill afford to lose. Napoleon's victory at Landshut secured his position in Bavaria and opened the path toward Vienna. More importantly, it separated Hiller's forces from the main Austrian army under Archduke Charles, forcing the Austrians to fight the coming battles at a significant numerical disadvantage. Did you know that Napoleon revolutionized artillery use in warfare? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible historical stories. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was Napoleon's greatest military strategy? Let me share something fascinating about Napoleon that many people don't realize. Before he became Emperor of France, before he conquered much of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte was an artillery officer. And not just any artillery officer, but one who had studied cannon tactics obsessively at the military academy in Brienne. This early specialization would transform warfare forever. You see, prior to Napoleon, artillery was typically treated as a supporting arm, cumbersome, slow-moving pieces that were positioned before a battle and rarely moved afterward. Cannons were seen as defensive weapons or siege tools, not agile instruments of battlefield victory. Napoleon completely revolutionized this thinking. Having risen through the ranks as an artillery commander, he understood these weapons better than perhaps any general in history. At Landshut, we can see his artillery genius on full display. As the battle unfolded, Napoleon didn't just place his cannon in static positions. He created what he called artillery batteries of the reserve, mobile groups of 12 to 36 guns that could be rapidly deployed wherever they were needed most. When he spotted Austrian formations preparing to counterattack near the Eastern Bridge, he personally directed a battery of 12-pounders to high ground, overlooking the position. Within 15 minutes, these guns unleashed what witnesses described as a storm of iron upon the Austrian ranks. What made Napoleon's approach truly revolutionary was the speed at which his artillery moved. He had redesigned the gun carriages to be lighter while maintaining their strength. His cannon crews were drilled relentlessly until they could fire 3 rounds per minute, nearly twice the rate of their Austrian counterparts. At Landshut, one battery commanded by Colonel Jean-Baptiste Vaquier fired over 100 rounds in just 30 minutes, shattering an Austrian square that had formed to resist French cavalry. Napoleon also pioneered the concept of artillery concentration. Rather than spreading his guns evenly across the battlefield, he would mass them at critical points to achieve overwhelming firepower. When the Austrian reserves appeared on the Moose Road around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon rapidly concentrated 48 guns against them. The devastating barrage broke the Austrian formation before it could even deploy, with survivors describing the experience as standing in a hailstorm where every hailstone could tear a man apart. But perhaps most innovative was Napoleon's use of horse artillery, or flying artillery as it became known. These were light cannon crews specially trained to move at galloping speed, set up, fire, and move again. At Landshut, When General von Hiller began his retreat, Napoleon dispatched Captain Antoine Dru with 6 horse artillery pieces to race ahead of the withdrawing Austrians and set up an ambush at a narrow pass east of the town. The resulting carnage caught the Austrians completely by surprise, turning their orderly retreat into a rout. The Emperor's personal involvement with his artillery was notable throughout the battle. Unlike many commanders who viewed themselves as above technical matters, Napoleon could often be seen sighting the guns himself. An aide recorded that at a critical moment in the battle, Napoleon dismounted, pushed aside a young artillery lieutenant, and personally adjusted a cannon, declaring, "This is how we did it at Toulon," referring to the 1793 siege that had first brought him to prominence. Napoleon's artillery innovations permanently changed warfare. After Landshut and the subsequent Napoleonic campaigns, no army could afford to treat artillery as merely supporting weapons again. The tactics he developed, mobile batteries, massed fires, counter-battery targeting, and close integration of artillery with infantry and cavalry maneuvers, became standard doctrine in every European army. Even more remarkably, many of Napoleon's artillery principles remain relevant today, over 2 centuries later. Modern field artillery still operates on fundamentally Napoleonic concepts of mobility, concentration of fires, and rapid redeployment. When you see footage of contemporary artillery units racing to a position, setting up quickly, firing and moving again, what military professionals now call shoot and scoot, you're witnessing the enduring legacy of the artillery revolution that helped Napoleon triumph at battles like Landshut. The ripple effects of Napoleon's victory at Landshut extended far beyond the blood-soaked fields of Bavaria. While it might not be as famous as Austerlitz or Waterloo, this crucial battle fundamentally altered the balance of power in Central Europe and accelerated the reshaping of the continent. In the immediate aftermath, Landshut secured Napoleon's strategic position in Bavaria, transforming it from contested territory into a secure base of operations. The Bavarians, already aligned with France since 1805, now found their loyalty rewarded as Napoleon's protective umbrella extended firmly over their kingdom. King Maximilian I of Bavaria personally visited the battlefield days later and awarded French officers with Bavarian military decorations, symbolic gestures that demonstrated how thoroughly this German state had fallen into Napoleon's orbit. But the true significance of Landshut was its role as a stepping stone toward Vienna. With von Hiller's force defeated and separated from the main Austrian army, Napoleon could now advance toward the Habsburg capital with confidence. Just 20 days after Landshut, French eagles were flying over Vienna, the second time in 4 years that Napoleon had captured this prestigious European capital. The psychological impact on the Austrian leadership was devastating. Perhaps more importantly, Landshut showcased Napoleon's remarkable ability to transform potential defeat into decisive victory. When the Austrians launched their 1809 campaign, they believed they had caught the French emperor at his most vulnerable, with his forces scattered and his attention divided by troubles in Spain. The speed with which Napoleon reorganized his forces, countered the Austrian advance, and then seized the initiative at battles like Landshut demonstrated a level of military adaptability that left other European powers in awe and terror. There's a fascinating piece of correspondence that illustrates this point. After learning of the French victory at Landshut, Russia's Tsar Alexander I reportedly told his foreign minister Count Rumyantsev, "It seems God himself fights for this man." How else could he have anticipated the Austrian move so perfectly? This statement from the ruler of a nation that had itself been humbled by Napoleon at Austerlitz reveals the almost supernatural reputation Napoleon had acquired among his contemporaries. For Austria, Landshut marked more than just another battlefield defeat. It represented the beginning of the end of their status as a first-rate European power. The Habsburg Empire had once dominated Central Europe, standing as the bulwark against Ottoman expansion and the leading German power. After the 1809 campaign that began with defeats like Landshut, Austria was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Schönbrunn. The terms of this treaty were brutal. Austria lost territory containing over 3.5 million subjects, including valuable lands in Galicia, Carniola, and the Adriatic coast. They were forced to pay an indemnity of 85 million francs, an astronomical sum that crippled their economy. Perhaps most humiliatingly, Emperor Francis I had to give his daughter, Marie-Louise, in marriage to Napoleon the following year, cementing Austrian subordination through dynastic ties. The battle transformed military thinking throughout Europe. Following Landshut and the broader 1809 campaign, armies across the continent rushed to adopt Napoleonic tactics. The Prussians, in particular, studied these battles obsessively. A young Prussian officer named Karl von Clausewitz, who would later become history's most influential military theorist, analyzed the Landshut maneuvers in detail for his developing concepts of maneuver warfare. There's a poignant historical footnote to Landshut that's often overlooked. Among the Austrian prisoners taken was a young lieutenant named Karl Mack von Leiberich, nephew of the General Mack, who had surrendered an entire Austrian army to Napoleon at Ulm in 1805. The young Mack reportedly told his French captors, "My uncle surrendered without fighting. At least at Landshut, we gave you a battle to remember." A dream. This statement reflects both the bitter Austrian experience of repeated defeats and their determination to maintain military honor even in failure. Today, if you visit Landshut, you'll find few markers of this momentous battle. The picturesque Bavarian town with its Gothic spires and Renaissance courtyards gives little indication that its streets and bridges once ran with the blood of thousands. A small plaque near the old stone bridge mentions the Great Battle of 1809, but most tourists pass it without a second glance. Perhaps this is fitting. Napoleon's legacy was always more about the grand sweep of history than individual battlefields. The world order he created, challenged, destroyed, and inadvertently helped rebuild through his defeats continues to shape our modern international system in ways that extend far beyond the memory of a single bloody day on the banks of the river Isar. As the sun set over the blood-soaked fields of Landshut on that April evening in 1809, few of the surviving soldiers could have imagined how this single battle would reshape the course of European history. The Battle of Landshut stands as a testament to Napoleon's military genius, his ability to assess a battlefield, adapt his strategy in real time, and transform what could have been a costly stalemate into a decisive victory. Through his brilliant maneuvering, innovative use of artillery, and masterful coordination of infantry and cavalry, Napoleon once again demonstrated why he was considered the foremost commander of his age. The speed with which he recognized the futility of frontal assaults on the bridges, redirected his forces to multiple crossing points, and then enveloped the Austrian position speaks to a mind that operated on a different plane than his contemporaries. Yet, as we marvel at these tactical achievements, we cannot ignore the human cost of such battles. Behind the strategic brilliance and the colorful uniforms lay the broken bodies of thousands of young men. In the hospitals of Landshut and surrounding villages, wounded soldiers from both sides suffered terribly, many dying slow, painful deaths from infections that our modern medicine could easily treat. Austrian prisoners of war faced long marches to France, with many never seeing their homeland again. The fields where French hussars had charged so gallantly became mass graves. Local farmers would continue to unearth bones, buttons, and bullets for decades afterward. One Bavarian farmer reportedly found so many human remains while ploughing his field in 1820 that he dedicated a small chapel to the fallen of both armies, a rare monument to the shared suffering of supposed enemies. We know from surviving letters that a young Austrian lieutenant named Joseph Radetzky, who would later become one of the Habsburg Empire's greatest field marshals, lost his brother at Landshut. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "Thomas died not knowing whether his sacrifice would matter in the great scheme of things. I fear none of us can know this." These poignant words remind us that behind every casualty figure was a human being with hopes, fears, and loved ones waiting at home. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of Landshut is how quickly it was overshadowed by even larger and bloodier battles. Just 5 days later, the Battle of Eckmühl would claim even more lives. And within 5 years, Europe would witness the horrors of Borodino, Leipzig, and ultimately Waterloo. Battles where casualties were counted not in thousands, but in tens of thousands. This raises profound questions about the nature of conflict and ambition. Napoleon secured his dominance over Central Europe at Landshut, but how long did this victory last? By 1815, his empire had collapsed, and the borders of Europe had been redrawn yet again. The men who died along the river Isar had given their lives for a political reality that would endure less than a single decade. As modern viewers looking back across more than 2 centuries, we can appreciate Napoleon's military brilliance while still questioning whether any territorial ambition or dynastic dispute could justify such sacrifice. Perhaps the true legacy of battles like Landshut is not just in their strategic innovations, but in their stark reminder of war's terrible cost. A lesson humanity continues to learn and forget with tragic regularity. If you've enjoyed this exploration of one of history's pivotal military engagements, please take a moment to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate historical depth beyond the simplified versions we often encounter. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more content that examines the triumphs, tragedies, and turning points of the modern era. Your support helps us continue bringing these crucial historical narratives to life.